Okay, we'll try to do this one more time. Hopefully not too many people hopped on that last one. We got one guy coming on. I'll probably start this intro once we hit about, oh, we're going up pretty high. So probably start this when we get to maybe 20, or how about this? I will share now what I do. For those of you who are following me on Twitter or have found me on Periscope, you probably know me as the guy who eats a lot of meat and lifts weights and has abs. But I actually have a job during the day that does not involve eating meat and lifting weights. And that job is being the director of business development at a global cryptocurrency exchange called OKCoin. OKCoin was one of the first cryptocurrency exchanges to exist in the world, founded about 8 years ago in Beijing. As you guys might be aware, Bitcoin is popular in the US, but it's incredibly popular in Asia for a number of reasons that I can get into later. But maybe before we get started, I think it would be helpful to just share what we're hoping to do with this live stream. Please ask questions because we can, I don't want to get in too much detail on this because I think that people, they just throw a lot of details out there that don't matter for an intermediate or beginner audience, and they confuse people and they make these people, not really think that they can understand Bitcoin. And I think that's wrong. I think, my goal here is to explain Bitcoin the way you would explain a car. I'm not trying to explain a combustion engine. I'm just trying to explain, this is why a car is helpful to get you from point A to point B. So it would probably be helpful for me to give you a little bit of my background financially before diving into Bitcoin as a whole. So my first job when I got done playing minor league baseball was I ended up working for a hedge fund manager who was based in Hong Kong. So I was about 23 years old, had no real work experience at the time, but a very wealthy fan of my college baseball team. He and I got to chatting because a lot of people suggested as an ex-athlete with an economics degree, I would do well in the financial services industry. I was obviously interested in that and making money and all that stuff. And so I ended up connecting with a wealthy donor to our Vanderbilt baseball team who just happened to run a hedge fund out in Hong Kong. And so this was back in 2010. He had gotten off of a big year in 2009, made a lot of money after not losing that much money in 2008. So he was on his high horse. And he was a very, very different kind of thinker. So this guy's kid back in 2011 was buying Bitcoin at like $2 a Bitcoin. He was flying me around on private jets when I was 23 years old, explaining to me how he viewed the world to work. And so before, explaining some of the conspiracy theories he had me research, it probably would be helpful to share why I trusted this guy who is a very eccentric thinker. And so remember, at 23 years old, first job, no previous work experience, I meet him down at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And the Beverly Hills Hotel, if you guys are familiar with Pretty Woman, it's a very nice hotel. He was taking me to dinners that I would never go to on my own, flying me obviously in luxurious jets that I would never go on without him. And he had very different ideas that I hadn't heard from anybody. First thing that he mentioned is that the first thing he mentioned was actually that the entire recovery post 2008 was fake, that the economy actually wasn't doing better, and that all the government and Federal Reserve did was bail out the banks. And so this was actually very different from everything that I had been experiencing, like watching mainstream media, which I did before encountering him. So following mainstream media in like 2010, you think, oh, the recovery is underway. And he's like, there's no recovery. There's not going to be a recovery. And so I remember driving through LA with him in 2010, and his eyes are like the size of pinheads because he's just very like, this is what's going on. And so, clean streets, clean enough streets back in 2010. And he's saying there's going to be tent cities everywhere. He said this very coldly, like the writing was on the wall, no discussion. Obviously, there's going to be tent cities everywhere. And I thought, 11 years ago, I'm like, this guy's nuts. I'm going to listen to him because he's like made a lot of money, but he's nuts. And after working for him for over a year, I came to realize why he said that there were going to be tent cities in LA, San Francisco, and around the US. And the reason that he said there was going to be tent cities was because I think it would be a good movie script too. The reason he said that there would be tent cities was because the economy was doing poorly, right, which everybody knows post 2008. But what not everybody knows is that the mechanisms by which the US government and the Federal Reserve took to bail out the banks, obviously that was to help the banks. But what it also did was create inflation in the stock market and inflation in asset markets. And so the actual way that the government, quote unquote, saved us from a depression in 2008 was to inject dollars into securities markets. And the more dollars that are in markets with the same amount of securities means the price of the securities will tend to go higher. And all of these millionaires and billionaires have a lot more money in the form of stocks and bonds and gold and other resources that they own on the whole. And everybody else is poorer. And the reason why everyone else is poorer is because the unemployment rate's not going down. And the resources that rich people are buying with this cheap money, oil, corn, things that you need to like live your life, those are going up in value because there's more dollars chasing those. And so what nobody talks about when they're studying the homeless situation in San Francisco and LA, in various regions of the US, is this is definitely a byproduct of an inflationary environment that the government created to bail out the banks. And people kind of realized this back in Occupy Wall Street, but I think over 10 years, the powers that be have successfully diverted the attention of the class-conscious individuals towards like race, sex, identity politics, and away from the big picture, which is how they're getting all the money and you're getting none. And so, one of the conspiracy theories that I researched when I was working for this guy was the foundation of the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, I graduated with honors with an economics degree from Vanderbilt University. I studied, central banking. I studied the banking structures in general. I could explain to you how fractional reserve banking works. Now, I would imagine half the people watching might not understand how fractional reserve banking works. And if that's the case, just leave a comment in and I can cover it. I don't want to get into it if people have a general sense of how fractional reserve banking works. But the moral of the story is this conspiracy theorist had me reading some books, biographies about the origins of the Federal Reserve. And so he had me read The Creature of Jekyll Island. He had me read a lot of literature around the beginning of the 20th century, which a lot of weird stuff happened around then. Income tax was created, Federal Reserve was created, World War I was about to start. All these things are all interconnected. And what I learned doing a lot of this research is how much the American elite, the JP Morgans, the Rockefellers, influenced government policy in a way that wasn't taught to us when we were in school. And so, the big thing that I don't know Big Square. The big thing that I took away from it wasn't actually the creation of the Federal Reserve, but it was the entrance into World War I. So if you guys had a history teacher like me in high school, you learned that the United States entered World War I because the Germans bombed the Lusitania, right? If you asked me that 10 years ago, I would say the Germans bombed the Lusitania. Hi, Adam. What I learned working for this hedge fund manager was that the United States didn't actually enter World War I until about 21 months after the Germans bombed the Lusitania. And what ended up happening, and probably Adam can correct me if my history recollection is wrong, is Wall Street bet very substantially on the British dominating the Germans in World War I. And so, imagine how loans work at the time. JP Morgan and other banks are like, oh, I can get 7% interest loaning the crown money. Obviously, they're going to pay me back. This is like easy money. So they're loaning. Wall Street's loaning all this money to Britain, assuming they're going to dominate, Germany and pay them back. And that was not actually how things worked. So the Germans were very, very close to encircling the island of Britain, right? And so if you think about how Britain works, it's a small island, and they successfully colonized like the rest of the world to bring resources to that small island. So if U-boats or different boats were able to encircle that island and stop goods from entering the island, they don't actually have enough food to feed everybody, which means they would have to forfeit. They would have to declare defeat And by declaring defeat, they would eventually default on their bonds, which would topple over Wall Street. And so this was not an acceptable solution, right? Woodrow Wilson ran for president in 1916 on a peace plan, right? Nobody wanted the United States to get into the European war, but when Wall Street was in trouble because the UK wasn't going to pay them back, have to remember Wall Street has a lot of connections in the media. And so this might be a very similar theme that we're seeing 100 years later. But JP Morgan, it came out in congressional testimony, had about 25 editors of major newspapers on his payroll, because if you can influence how news is presented, you can make more money. And so they started, banging the drums for war. If you guys have seen Century of Self, a BBC documentary about Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, who is the godfather of the modern PR agency, he wrote a book called Propaganda. He also was the major pusher of basically selling consumer goods, selling goods to people, selling things to people that they didn't need. And so, what JP Morgan ended up doing was using his 25 contacts in various newspapers and getting everybody scared, and basically, convincing them that we're going to make the world safe for democracy. Yeah, exactly, Virginia Slim cigarettes. We're going to make the world safe for democracy, and we're going to get into this war. Now, obviously, JP Morgan knew that we're going to get into the war so he can get paid back by the UK. As a well-connected, wealthy individual, he had all of his buddies on these war industry boards. And so JP Morgan himself, John Pierpont Morgan, made like the equivalent of billions of dollars by getting his buddies on war industry boards to assign war contracts to companies that he also owned, right? So you have one guy who was going to get screwed by the UK not paying him back, using his media contacts to make everybody scared, right? To then have a solution for being scared, which is send contracts to companies that I also own, right? And so this happened at the same time, about a couple of years later, than when the Federal Reserve was created. And so if you read The Creature of Jekyll Island, you'll realize that the Federal Reserve is not a quasi-private, quasi-governmental institution. Like, the Federal Reserve Chairman has to like talk to Congress and all that stuff. But if you actually look at how the Fed chairman is selected, it's selected by major banks, right? You don't select the Federal Reserve Chairman. I don't select the Federal Reserve Chairman. Congress doesn't select the Federal Reserve Chairman, right? I think 7 out of 12, maybe 5 out of 12, but half, close enough to where with good lobbying influence, they can get a majority of the people on their side, are of the 12 board of governors are selected by banks. So the people who are in control of the amount of currency that will exist in circulation are the banks. It is not Congress, it is not you, it's the banks. And the amount of currency that will exist in circulation is about the amount that makes them the most money. And so once we saw in 2008 that, if the banks get in trouble, we're going to bail them out. We're going to pay $700 billion or more, probably trillions if you consider the expansion of the Fed's balance sheet. This was very, very problematic. And so the hedge fund that I was working at actually invested in gold at the time. So the hedge fund manager, the 60-year-old hedge fund manager, bought about 2 tons of gold that he kept in the Hong Kong airport, while his kid bought like, hundreds or maybe even thousands of Bitcoin at the time at like $2. And so we didn't touch the asset at first. And the reason we didn't touch the asset was because we believe that the United States has a very solid history of going to war against other countries that disintermediate or get in the way of the US dollar being used as an international settlement currency. And so, if you're familiar with like kind of some background in how the US dollar works, so the US dollar used to be backed by gold. After World War II, the United States realized that if we were going to like be successful and like also win a Cold War or something like that, we needed to have viable trading partners, right? Because our, at the time, manufacturing dependent economy would have nobody to sell products to if they were living in bombed out shanties like Western Europe was after World War II. So we needed to not only finance the rebuilding of Europe, but also create a financial system that would allow a lot of people to exchange goods and services very easily. And so the easiest way to do that was to suggest we're going to have the US dollar as the international settlement currency. So if you, German, want to buy something in France, you don't have to worry about the exchange rate between German marks and French francs. Everybody just buys the dollar, and we can just transact with everything in dollars. The US is the largest economy in the world. And the French were like, yeah, but like, what's stopping you from just printing a bunch of them? And so our response was, oh yeah, so no matter how many dollars you bring us, we will always give you 1 ounce of gold in return for $35. You bring us $35,000, we'll give you 35,000 ounces of gold. It's called the gold window, and it was open for about 27 years. Now, the challenge of backing your dollars with a hard metal is you can't create an infinite amount of dollars if you don't have an infinite amount of metal. And so when Lyndon Johnson was president, he both created the quote unquote Great Society programs, which I think are probably more of a degenerate society program system, but then he was also involved in the Vietnam War. And so that's a lot of spending, right? A lot of money, a lot of government debt being used to finance these activities, wars abroad, and then all this domestic spending that he was doing inside. And by the time that Richard Nixon came into office, the French called this out on their bullshit. And they realized, they're like, you're never going to pay us back the gold that you owe us. We don't want these paper dollars. Like, give us all the gold that you owe us. And so Richard Nixon said, and this is very key for those who spent 2 weeks flattening the curve. Richard Nixon said in August 1971, we are going to temporarily suspend the conversion from the dollar to gold. And that temporary stoppage has lasted 40 years. Any day now, I'm sure we're going to go back. And the consequence of this is a lot of people were worried that why would anybody use a US dollar to buy things? Why would people accept US dollars if it's not backed by anything? And so our government realized that oil is completely necessary for every economy to operate on. And so if we could make sure that the dollar was used at least to purchase oil, then we would still always have demand for dollars. And if we always have international demand for dollars, that gives us a lot more flexibility in terms of how much money we spent on wars and stuff, right? Because no other country in the world can run, trillion-dollar government deficits every year, 150%, 200% debt to GDP. I guess Japan can do that. But most countries cannot be as let's say, reckless in their spending as the United States does, because there isn't international demand for their currency, right? And so all of this kind of combines together to where the level of corruption that we can tolerate due to the position of the US dollar in the world economy is higher than the level of corruption I think that a lot of other countries can tolerate. This obviously doesn't please a bunch of autists on the internet, right? So there's a lot of really smart people who can explain all of these things to you in much greater detail. And, and they believed, and I'm assuming Satoshi Nakamoto is multiple people, not one, nobody really knows. But they believed that a digital, digital currency, digital gold, could be used as an alternative currency to the US dollar. And so once you take fiat currency and the generation of this fiat currency and the power of being able to produce currency away from powerful individuals, they're no longer as powerful. They can no longer be as corrupt. And another thing that you can do with Bitcoin, it's very easy to transport it, right? So as an owner, right, you can put 1 million Bitcoin, right? If you had 1 million Bitcoin, you could put 1,000 Bitcoin in a wallet. You can carry it country to country, and it's pretty hard for a government to take it away from you. But you can't do the same with gold, right? You can't just travel with bricks and bricks of gold and expect them to not notice the amount of gold that you're carrying with you. And so Bitcoin itself was created as sort of a counterculture to the present financial system, right? And it started back in, yes, Charles Galt did break the gold, I believe. And so Bitcoin was created as a alternative to the existing banking structure. There is a substantial debate within the cryptocurrency is this something that is going to be used as cash one day, or is this just going to be a store of value? And it can go in many different directions. I personally think that it does need to adopt more of the features of a currency in order for it to, actually stick. At this point, it is more of a store of value. It's more, hey, I'm scared about inflation. I'm going to go buy Bitcoin. So if the cost of my groceries goes up, the price of my Bitcoin goes from 60K to 100K. And so that can kind of offset it. What we saw in 2020 was a couple different things that I think pumped the market quite substantially. So a lot of you guys are reading Bitcoin is now trading around $55,000, $60,000. Back when Adam got in December, it was trading at around $20,000. But like back in August, it was like $10,000, and at the beginning of the year, it was like beginning of 2020 is like $6,000. And so Bitcoin itself, because it's not top-down controlled like a lot of other currencies, or every other currency for that matter. It is more of a libertarian currency. It's easier to use as internet money than a lot of other services, right? There's not a multi-day delay before you get your Bitcoin the way it would be if you're sending US dollars over PayPal. So it makes country-to-country transactions for individuals a lot easier. If I have a merchant or something that I want to do business with overseas, it could take a week or so for a dollar wire to get there. Where if I just send them digital money, it's gonna get there right away. And so Bitcoin, in some ways, is better suited to exist in a 21st century ecosystem. But part of that has to do with the regulation just hasn't really caught up, because you theoretically could send dollars faster if the entire system were built today, and they didn't have like the money laundering concerns and all that. And so, yeah, we've seen, basically Bitcoin is going to go up as people lose faith in institutions. And I think what we've learned, over the last 5 years, but especially over the last 1 year, is how fucking full of shit everybody is. All these people who, will say one thing, but then if you actually closely analyze them, they have no idea what they're talking about. All of the grownups in the room, if there are any, are playing make-believe. And what happens is, if you have a lot of people playing make-believe, the projects that they're trying to create tend to fail. And so this is very visible in 2020. A lot of things that people didn't realize were broken or were close to breaking kind of broke. And the Fed and the US government created a lot of liquidity that entered financial markets. And then part of that ended up going towards speculative assets like Bitcoin. And so I remember tweeting maybe 6 months ago that, I'm not looking forward to a world where Bitcoin is trading at $50,000, but I am prepared for one. Not thinking that 4 months later, 6 months later, Bitcoin would actually be at now over $50,000, but here we are. And so, I'm not here to shill people on saying you must buy Bitcoin now. It's quite expensive right now. I don't know. The price could go down. I'm still holding. I haven't really sold. I sold maybe 1% or so of my holdings, but so most of my Bitcoin that I bought, I still own. And yeah, so I'm happy to open the floor for questions. I know it was a way for restoring individual sovereignty. Yes, and Meltem holds her Bitcoin on a private wallet. And so another thing that people consider when you buy Bitcoin, so the easiest thing to do to buy Bitcoin, you can sign up for our exchange, okcoin.com. There's obviously major players like a Coinbase, or if you're in Europe, you can do a Bitstamp, Kraken, or us or them. But there's a lot of different players you can buy Bitcoin from. A minor rift in the Bitcoin community is who's actually holding your Bitcoin. Because a lot of people who own Bitcoin hold it on Coinbase, and that's all fine when everything's going good. But then what if the government wants to confiscate it? And so, like, if the government wanted to confiscate Meltem's Bitcoin, they couldn't, because they don't know where it is. It's not under her name in a brokerage account. It's like somewhere overseas. I don't know where exactly, but I know it's not in exchanges. And so, the second layer of the sovereign individual types, and there's a reason why you see so much overlap between a lot of the personal fitness people, the personal finance people, and the crypto people, is because they're all mentally oriented towards individual performance, individual sovereignty, being a self-responsible individual, and understanding that a lot of the institutions that other people may depend on can't actually deliver for them. So that's why you build your body. That's why you build your asset portfolio. And that's why you might hold crypto. So thoughts on Ethereum. I hold some Ethereum. I mistakenly, I very intentionally, but mistakenly sold some last year. And I sold a little bit more earlier this year. So I'm still holding on to about 33% of the Ethereum that I initially purchased. I wish I had more. Ethereum, I think, is, if there is to be an alternative to Bitcoin, I like Ethereum. I like the fact that a lot of decentralized finance is more reliant on Ethereum. I like the fact that there are other protocols that are able to be built on top of Ethereum. So, one of the projects, and I said I wasn't going to be shilling alternative assets, but I will share because you asked. One of the projects that I invested in 2 years ago is called Origin Protocol. And the reason I invested in Origin Protocol is because they were creating, and they are creating, an exchange for goods that cannot be, like purchased in, normal jurisdictions. And so they always talked about like banned books, right? So in the Middle East, like if you wanted to buy a book on homosexuality or something, I imagine a lot of countries you couldn't actually buy it. So that was the story that they were telling back 2-3 years ago. But now, when Amazon and eBay won't list Dr. Seuss books, right, there's still going to be a demand for this sort of stuff, right? There's still going to be a demand for decentralized marketplaces when a lot of the major players start to feel pressured by, cancel culture, the woke mob. They will remove, the easiest thing for them to do to keep things going is they're just going to remove that product, pretend it never existed, and you can't buy it there. But there's still going to be user demand for goods like this on a marketplace. And so that is what I think is going to end up happening, bridging the gap between using crypto and using the regular centralized internet. Because I'll be honest, it's still easier to use the regular internet than to use crypto, right? It's still nerve-wracking to see crypto leave your wallet, and then you wait a little bit, and then until you actually see it in the other wallet that you send it to. And so, I think the first major use cases for cryptocurrencies for Bitcoin, other than gambling, which is, I think, a lot of the activity that we see right now, is going to be around use cases that don't actually have an alternative, right? People will put up with a challenging, a challenging user experience if that's the only option they have. If they have other options, they're not going to put up with a challenging user experience. So I thought back in 2017, a lot of people investing in these decentralized platforms, it seemed laughable because there was no reason at the time for people to be using a decentralized platform for most things. But now, as the world becomes crazier and crazier and crazier, a lot of things probably will be eventually transacted on decentralized platforms. So those, pie in the sky idealistic pitches 3 years ago, 3 years from now, might not actually seem so crazy. So yeah, and if we have any other questions, happy to cover them. Hope this was helpful for the folks who are joining. Again, I didn't want to get into too many minor details around, this is what a block is, this is how validation works, this is how mining works, because I really think that distracts a lot of people from the idea of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies in general. If we want to talk about that, ping me. We can probably talk about that a little bit more, although I'm not the best person to speak to about that. But if you're trying to understand why Bitcoin is where it is today, it's symptomatic of a lot of the institutions that we grew up around actually potentially being, maybe not on their deathbed, but certainly middle-aged, right? And you don't know how long you have to live when you're middle-aged, and there's always young guns trying to take you out. And so, is that going to be Bitcoin? I don't know. But, I do see a lot of upside in the cryptocurrency. Again, right now, about half of my net worth is in it. I'm not selling it. If I needed short-term cash, perhaps I would sell a little bit of it. But until then, I'm going to be holding it. I do expect the price to go up from here. I don't know if that's going to take 6 months or 6 years, right? It's a very, very volatile asset. So if it's something that you're thinking about getting into, like if you can't tolerate an 80% decline and not really blink an eye and just kind of go to sleep and just wait for it to be a rebound, then it's probably not the right asset for you. Because a lot of people, bought crypto even like a few years ago, and then they saw the decline 60%. They say, screw it, I'm out. And guess what? You bought Bitcoin at 20K, it's 8K. You sold at 8K because you want to get your money back, and now it's 60K. And these types of ups and downs are very typical. How soon do you see it being used in mainstream commerce? So I think the better question is, how long do you think mainstream will be continued to be defined as mainstream, right? Because I think what we're seeing right now is a fracturing of how our society is functioning. Especially like with COVID, who knows what's going to end up happening with, all these COVID vaccines, right? Are businesses going to deny you services if you don't have a COVID vaccine, right? There's going to be a larger underground economy as cancel culture becomes larger, as the pressure to censor becomes larger, as technology grows more powerful. There's going to be a lot of pressure to like cancel a lot of people, cancel a lot of verticals, cancel a lot of industries. These people are still going to have assets. They're still going to have earning power. They're still going to have the ability to produce and consume. And so there's going to end up needing to be a mechanism that they can use to transact. And so I actually wrote, it's really interesting timing. And if you want to type this in, just Google it. You can probably find the article. In I think December 2020, so 4 months ago, I wrote, Bitcoin will be the currency of the canceled. So if you just Google Bitcoin currency of the canceled, you'll see my Medium post. This is before Trump got kicked off of Twitter. Like, we all knew that he was going to eventually get kicked off after he got out of office, but we probably didn't expect him to get kicked off while he was in office. And so what we knew was happening 4 months ago is that, they made up a reason to ban Alex Jones, to kick him off of the internet. They're doing, they did the same for Trump. They're going to, that's not going to stop. There's going to be dozens and dozens of examples like these. And then there's going to be more pressure applied to the payment processors, to Visa, to PayPal. Like, don't work with these guys. They're evil. They're spreading white supremacy. And you should not have that many tabs open, Tony. Probably this is bad web hygiene. But, a lot of people are going to get canceled. And if this cancel culture virus can metastasize large enough to where they're disintermediated from the mainstream financial system, right? Well, Trump's going to still want to have a social network, right? Milo Yiannopoulos is still going to try to make money. Alex Jones is still going to try to make money. And people are still going to be interested in what these people are saying. And so they're going to end up using alternative currencies to end up buying these products. So yeah. Is it concerning that a good percentage of Bitcoin is owned by China? Yeah, it is. And that's something that nobody talks about. So, let's step into conspiracy theory on this. I have no proof at all that this is going on, but I do understand incentives, right? So, if you're familiar with history from a financial perspective, you would know that a lot of countries are constantly trying to remove the dollar from reserve currency status. Because basically, if you guys didn't realize, or if you guys weren't tuning in for earlier in this stream, the reason we can have a $700 billion Pentagon budget is because we can run $700 billion deficits every year, right? And the reason we can run $700 billion deficits every year is because there's an international demand for our currency, because it's used to buy oil, right? So every enemy of ours or frenemy of ours realizes that this is a thing that exists. And none of them want the US dollar to continue to be the global reserve currency, because that is the thing that is used to build US military bases all around the world. And so Russia tried, China tried, and they're going to keep trying, right? Saddam Hussein tried, right? And these guys are going to keep trying, because if China can get the yuan to be used as a settlement currency for petroleum, then guess what? China can start running the same deficits and start playing the same games that the US has been playing, even though they play a different set of games themselves. And so, think for a second, what is actually happening as Bitcoin went from 1,000 to 10,000 to 60,000 is they're enriching a lot of young, intelligent Americans who will put pressure on the US government to, co-adopt Bitcoin as a national currency, as a utility currency. And so, imagine that there's 50 different young, intelligent Bitcoin billionaires in the US. They're going to try to lobby Congress to change our policies, to integrate Bitcoin into US policy even more. And if they're successful, that's going to probably weaken the stance of the US dollar in the global community. And so who would like that better than China? I don't know, maybe Russia would. And so what people don't realize when they're saying Bitcoin can't be manipulated, it's not controlled by anybody, is like, you have no idea how many Bitcoin the CCP holds. They might hold 0, they might hold 60%. Nobody really knows and nobody talks about it. People should be talking about it, but not at this point. What about XRP? I think XRP is kind of dumb. Reason being is it's meant to bypass the SWIFT system. But the reality is, with some of these tokens, like if XRP was $1, would anybody use it? Right? At some point, if these things appreciate enough, they will price themselves out of being used. So for those not familiar, XRP is the currency that Ripple, is behind, even though they say they're not, for legal liability purposes. So it was brought into the market as, you can use XRP as a settlement token. If one bank owes another bank $5 million, you just send XRP, whatever. And so that doesn't work if the thing that's supposed to be cheaply utilized and exchanged is like priced up so much, right? If XRP was like $10, would any bank be like, oh yeah, that's great, we'll start buying a bunch of XRP and use that to transact? Like, no, they wouldn't. Okay. I don't know. Yeah. Well, okay. Can't disagree. Garbage. I don't know. Garbage. I don't know that I would say that, but I say that I don't quite understand what the upside is there. Cool. So, we're approaching about 40 minutes. If anybody has any more questions, please ask them in the next 10 seconds. Somebody asked, they have options for 25K ETH by the end of this year. I think it's possible. I mean, probably not. People want to gamble. There's going to be like indefinite, there's always a sucker's bet, right? You think, like, oh yeah, I just need to put like $1,000 in there. And if it's 25K, I get like $1 million. Like, yeah, okay, you can do that. Stock to flow model, too sophisticated for this particular chat. I would imagine maybe 25% of the people on here would understand the difference between stocks and flows. But one last piece of advice, if you guys are looking for, I've not heard of Flare. If you guys are looking to like perceive the world in a different way, understand markets, right? So before you understand smart contracts, understand how markets work, understand how and why monopolies have leverage, understand what a monopsony is, because if you work a regular job, you're actually working within a monopsony, which is the flip side of a monopoly, and you actually have limited negotiating power because of that, but nobody explained it to you because they're busy profiting off of you. The better you can understand markets and market dynamics, the easier it is to make solid investments, the easier it is to avoid career pitfalls, the easier it is to make money without really working as hard. And so, your parents probably told you if you want to do well, you need to work really hard, and you do, but you need to understand how markets work, because if you understand how markets work, that's where you can apply, limited, a few bullets behind it, and it can go a long way. So it's my dinner time. I don't like working when I'm hungry. I don't like talking when I'm hungry. So I'm going to go cook some pizza, and I'll show you guys on Twitter in a little bit. Thanks for tuning in.